Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to have a couple more people join us, but want to make room for today's great presentation. Happy Thursday, happy April. My name is Betsy with the Seattle Metro Chamber, and so happy to have you join us for another Alaska Business Forum. I just have a few notes before we get started. First, I wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge that the Seattle Metro Chamber offices are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, both past and present, and I'd like to honor this land and the Duwamish people. So I have a few other housekeeping things. I know that we are all Zoom experts by now, but just as a reminder, you can be on video and you can see yourself and others on today's call. Please do remember to mute yourself during the presentation so we can hear everything clearly. And you'll notice that we do have a live transcript during today's session. If you'd prefer to hide that, you can click on live transcript and hide subtitle on the bottom of your screen, and that'll remove it for you. We will have a great opportunity for some questions at the end of our session today. So do take advantage of that. We don't have a question and answer box, but if you have a question, just let us know in the chat. No need to write your whole question. Just let us know I have a question and we will call on you live during the Q&A portion. You can also let us know you have a question with that raise hand feature in Zoom as well. And that'll let us know that you have a question. So those are all of my housekeeping things. I'd now like to turn it over to George Rowe, our chair of Alaska Business Forum, to get us started. George, welcome. Oh, and I'm gonna go ahead and unmute you, George. Oh, you do need to unmute, George.
I think I am.
There you go.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Business Forum. Thank you, Betsy, for your introduction and all the work you've done to coordinate this. I am the chair of the forum this year and your MC for today's program. This is actually the last forum that we have in this season. And although we're going to be taking a break for a couple months, I'm just absolutely convinced that today's program is going to give us so much to talk about in the meantime. Speakers are going to provide us with insights into the startups, innovation areas, investors, et cetera, that are all part of the greater entrepreneurial ecosystem in Alaska. And I just want to go on record saying that I think that ecosystem can go way beyond the borders of that state. And I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of partnerships and collaborations might come out of today's dialogue even. Before we get started, I want to pause and thank Alaska Airlines, somebody that helps make that ecosystem possible in terms of its connections, and ask Scott Hubbard from Alaska Airlines to make some remarks on behalf of our series sponsor. Scott, welcome.
George, thanks, and welcome to everybody. Looks like we have 26 people out there. Kind of saddened today's our last forum for the year, but totally understand what the Chamber's trying to do and focus on the community around them. And so, good on you for doing that. Hey, not a lot to share other than we are having a sale right now for travel to Alaska. It's to support the visitor industry or really anybody that wants to travel to Alaska. You get up to 21% off flights to Alaska in May for travel in May and June by using the code FLY2AK21. FLY2AK21 will get you up to 21% off on your flights in May and June. And with that, Betsy, I would like to thank you. I think you've done a great job for us this year, and we look forward to next year a little more normalcy. And with that, I'll turn it back over to George.
Thanks, Scott. I'd like to introduce our first speaker here, Isaac Vanderberg. Isaac's the CEO of a group called Launch Alaska and the fund manager for Launch Alaska Fund 2. That's a $3 million fund. They invest directly in the accelerator's cohort companies. Isaac's worked with hundreds of early stage companies and entrepreneurs that are responding to several different areas across Alaska: food, water, transportation, and energy, challenges being addressed in all of those spaces. Previously, he was the state director at the Alaska Small Business Development Center and the operations director for Chispa Group. Isaac, we are looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Great, thanks, George, and thank you for the invite. I realized last time I was here was in 2018, and it was a different world. So I really appreciate the invite back, and Betsy and Scott, thanks for hosting this forum. Also, Betsy, I really like the Zoom tutorial at the beginning there. That's good best practice. We might have to steal that from you. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here at the risk of testing Zoom to my technical limits here. Let's see. Hoping you can all see my screen.
Yep.
All right. So again, thanks for having me. Launch Alaska is a nonprofit 501c3 that supports the development of projects and development of technologies within companies. And basically what we're trying to do at Launch Alaska is to source some of the most innovative tech in the world to come to Alaska, meet with some of our asset owners in the state, and deploy real solutions with tangible results. We have a small but fierce team of folks here, 6 strong to date. And folks on our team, one theme is that everyone has, actually with the exception of myself, has a corporate background coming from places like Google and ABB, BP. We also have a strong, even though we're focused on energy transition and deploying climate tech solutions, we have several members who had a background in oil and gas. And so a diverse set of groups of folks on the team here. And so our mission at Launch Alaska is to accelerate the resource revolution. That means deploying game-changing technologies in food, water, transportation, and energy. So basically any technology that removes carbon from one of those 4 systems is something that we'll look at. And if I can share a video here, Pam does a much nicer job of talking about our tech deployment track than I do. So let me play a little video here.
It was a crazy 24 hours. We brought together a couple dozen startups from the lower 48, from Alaska, from all over the world, and about 30 panelists. So those were power players and decision makers from all over Alaska, including investors from outside, and brought them together for one very compressed, very intensive work session.
So far, it has been really great. Regardless of what happens, I've made contacts that will help me get to the next step.
We were on our last team presenting to the entire panel. In the middle of this team's presentation, one of our panel members throws his hands up in the air and starts talking to the person next to him. And so when we asked him what was going on, he said, "This is exactly what I was looking for."
That's really why we created the program the way we did, to try to get as many exciting, promising companies in front of as many decision makers and asset owners as we could.
We chose our panelists because they're a group of folks who have a bead on opportunities, challenges, projects in Alaska that might be really valuable to our startups. So that includes folks like utilities, municipalities, people that work at the native corporations, really this group of asset owners, folks that have decision authority over projects and over opportunities.
It has taken what can sometimes be a difficult or a long process to do due diligence for an investment, and has created a condensed version.
We're trying to get solutions to the most pressing problems of our day into the field. And the way we think that we can do that is by connecting people with solutions to the people with challenges. Okay. And so that's our tech deployment track overview. And it's basically a 4-session, if you think of it maybe like a 8-month Shark Tank, where we, over the course of these 4 intense sessions, we bring a bunch of panelists and a bunch of companies together. And then at each session, winnow down the number of companies. And basically, if you have a panelist that endorses you as a company, then you get to come back to the next session. If no one steps forward to say that there's a good fit for you with some potential customer in Alaska, then you go home and we don't waste your time anymore. And we can proceed with the program. So our panelists are really what make the program work. All these bright, shiny faces here, they come from Alaska Native corporations, investors, public sector, DOE. If you see the little Launch Alaska logo down on the bottom left of their picture, that means that they're also on our external review committee. So that's a group of technical research types that vet the technologies before they come into our program to make sure that they don't, violate like the second law of thermodynamics or something. We also have, this year we had a great set of new panelists. Again, if you've spent any time in Alaska, you probably recognize a bunch of these folks, but they really are what make the program work. And then the whole goal of the program, startups face this chicken or egg problem, where in order for them to raise a round, an investment round, they need to prove that they have traction with customers. And yet oftentimes in order to get traction with customers, they need to have some money to deploy a product or service. So there's a chicken or egg problem that we're running into, or that startups have to work with, and especially hardware startups. And so we're solving one of those two parts of the chicken or the egg. We're solving the traction part, helping companies get a deployment somewhere in Alaska with a partner in a real world setting, to show that they have demand, that their technology works, that they can deliver. And then from there, they use that traction to go raise rounds and go after much bigger markets. The whole point of the program, therefore, is to try to get these companies, these young companies with innovative technologies, to actually deploy in a real world setting. So after they go through our TDT program, which is where that's that 8-month Shark Tank, then we have a project pipeline, or an innovation partnership that they become a part of, where we're pulling these companies into real projects. So Launch Alaska has started doing a lot of building real projects in the state with the companies involved. And our goal is, feels lofty, and yet here we are in 2021 already making good progress on this goal, but we want to facilitate $1 billion of projects in the state among our companies by 2030. And there's some great early traction that we can point to. A recent RFP in Shugnak, Alaska. A couple of our companies responded to it and were successful in securing the first kind of solar and storage power purchase agreement. There's actually several bids on that project, and I think all except for one had our companies either leading it or being a part of the bidding team. We also have great success stories just from the last few months here. A group called Dynamex is working with the municipality of Anchorage to help manage and deploy their climate action plan. A group called Biomass Controls is working with a big mining operation called Tech, where they're deploying their solution on site there. And then another contract that is currently being negotiated with Homer, a company that has a plant-based solution to stop coastal erosion, to basically glue the land in place using an organic plant-based solution. And so they're deploying their solution on a privately owned part of the Homer Spit in Alaska. And then we also are starting to more and more get involved in actual site development and projects with real pieces of infrastructure. So we recently received a little bit of funding because we have a bunch of companies in the aerospace and aviation tech world. We received a little bit of funding to explore a aerospace innovation center at Merrill Field. Alaska has a incredible flight and aviation community. And there's a really exciting project coming together there, which I'd love to tell you more about if I had more than 15 minutes. We're also working with the Port of Alaska to help them establish the port as a microgrid, and to ensure that the port stays up and running if something happens to the grid. Really exciting project there. And again, on all of these projects, it's us leading, but our portfolio companies are involved in these projects because they have amazing things to say and great folks on their team that are helpful in doing things like economic analysis and modeling and all sorts of great components. So we're really kind of pointing the innovation among our companies at these real projects in Alaska. Another one where we've recently signed an innovation partnership with the Kotzebue Electric Association in Kotzebue to help them develop a roadmap to 100% renewable or 100% off diesel. And we're helping them develop long-term strategies and kind of coordinating the work for Kotzebue Electric over the course of the next several years. Although this, inevitably becomes a kind of 20-year plan for them. But again, in that project, a bunch of our companies are involved on the scope of the project, and we have a lot of smart people among our portfolio companies that are helping to kind of consult on this project. So yeah, one thing that we care about a lot at Launch Alaska is actually measuring our impact. And if you've followed us at all for the last few years, you will remember a few years ago when this report had mainly zeros everywhere. I feel good about that because I feel like we reported out back in the early days when we didn't have anything exciting to report on. But now that we have items that are more than zero, we feel very proud and confident in these numbers. So we track things like the average valuation among our companies, where the companies come from, job creation, and then also ESG, famous ESG metrics. I will say that we are talking to some of the leading players in the country on ESG, and any of you who have spent time on this know that everyone is thinking through this together, and this is kind of the early days of measuring ESG, but we are spending a lot of time both measuring our impact on our projects and also helping our companies set up their own approach to ESG work. Okay, so that was a mouthful. But before I leave you here, I would just welcome anyone that's interested in investing in any part of any of this, including our portfolio companies. Many of them are raising rounds currently, or in some of these projects where there are some great public-private partnerships coming together, and private dollars are as welcome as public dollars. Please reach out, start a conversation with us, or if any of you would like to be a panelist for on our TDT program, just to meet the companies. It's a terrifically fun thing to do, and one of the most intellectually stimulating days you'll spend in your year. And so we welcome you. Our panelists come from all over the country and really all over the world at this point. So we'd be happy to loop you in, even if you're based out of Seattle or elsewhere. Our major funder is the Office of Naval Research. We're incredibly grateful to them. And then NREL has been a key funder as well, and kind of mission partner to us. And then we couldn't do what we do without our great infrastructure partners, folks like REAP, ACEP, who are represented on the line here, and folks at the university and throughout Alaska. So we are incredibly grateful to them. All right, hopefully that was close to 15 minutes. Thanks, and I'll be around later for any questions when we're done.
Thanks very much, Isaac. I want to have us shift our attention now to our next speaker, Chris Rose. Chris is the founder and the executive director of the Renewable Energy Alaska Project. It's more commonly referred to as REAP. He's worked as a fundraiser for many different nonprofit public interest groups around the United States. Received his law degree from the University of Oregon. Whoops, I think somebody just, sorry. He has a certificate in environmental and natural resources law as part of that. He's been very active in local community affairs, and he's served on various statewide boards in Alaska, including the Renewable Energy Grant Fund Advisory Committee, which he currently chairs. Chris, so excited to hear from you.
Well, thank you, George, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks, Betsy, for organizing today. It is great to be back. It's been several years since I have addressed this group, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about what's going on with Alaska's clean energy transition. Can you please advance the next slide, Betsy? So REAP is a nonprofit. We're a statewide group. We've been around since 2004. And as George mentioned, we are a coalition of many different member organizations, dozens of organizations from diverse businesses and utilities to native corporations, NGOs, and a lot of developers. And our mission is simply to increase the development of renewable energy in Alaska and promote energy efficiency. We really look at the whole energy ecosystem in 4 buckets, if you will. Technology is one, and I think that's the one everyone likes to talk about all the time. You know, it's very fun to talk about all the renewable energy technologies that are moving forward. But we really focus more on the other three. And those are the really important ones to actually make a project work. As there's all kinds of people that are much more technical and smarter than we are developing these technologies. Those three other buckets are people, and that's probably the most important one in a lot of our smaller communities, making sure that we operate, maintain, and even optimize systems over time. Money, we can't do anything without money. This is a finance forum, investment forum. We've got to make sure that we find money to do this, and policy, which drives a lot of all that. We know that energy is the lifeblood of any economy, and it's certainly true in Alaska, where we have some of the highest energy costs in the country. Next, please. This is, I know you're all familiar with Alaska. It's a big place, but this infrastructure map is always interesting to see because it really shows just how little infrastructure we have. We've got a pretty small road system, and you can see from Anchorage to Fairbanks and then down to the Kenai Peninsula, we've got one fairly long and strung out, not so robust electric grid. And then in Southeast, we've got quite a bit of electricity, but still a lot of villages down there that have no connection. And then Western Northern Alaska is just full of communities that are not connected by transmission or by road. And we often just refer to these communities as microgrids. We can call them islanded grids or remote grids. There's all kinds of different terminology, but here is an opportunity to develop technology that the whole world really needs. All of these remote communities, all these microgrids are at the cutting edge right now of inserting renewables into their diesel grids because they have a huge financial incentive to do that. Next, please. So REAPS programs, the ones that I've highlighted in yellow are the ones I'm going to talk a little bit more about. We really focus on STEM education and workforce development. That's the people part that I talked about. We're also now working with national labs on a new program called the Energy Transition Initiative Partnership Program. And we work in Southeast Alaska. We work with the state of Alaska as one working group, and we also sponsor all kinds of conferences, speaker series, fairs, and so on. Next, please. A lot of the advocacy that we've done over the years has really resulted in programs and financing that have gotten a lot of what's going on in Alaska started. In 2008, we were successful in getting the Renewable Energy Fund passed by the legislature. The legislature since appropriated $270 million to that program, which has leveraged at least $200 million in federal and private money, resulting in more than 80 projects in those smaller communities I showed you that are renewable. Over $640 million we were able to get from the legislature for home weatherization. And the ones there at the bottom, I'm going to talk a little bit more about today. We're working to reform the electric grid that we live on here in the Anchorage area and develop a green bank for the state. That's financing and policy. Next, please. So starting with energy literacy, we talk about financial literacy, and people have just started to understand how important that is for kids in high school or even younger to understand money and understand how to balance a checkbook and how to take care of a home, the responsibilities with adulthood and so on. But energy literacy, I would argue, is even more important. We really want people to understand where energy comes from and the implications of all their energy decisions. I spoke to a class of graduate students at UAA a few years back, and I was just stunned when I asked a group of 20 adults where electricity in Anchorage came from, and 3 out of 20 got it right. So I don't think that's that uncommon around the country that people just turn on switches and make things go. But there's a big backstory to all of our energy decisions. And so this is where we start. And as Isaac mentioned, the big support from the Office of Naval Research to launch us, ONR is also really supporting a lot of the STEM education efforts that we are working on around the state. We are working with several different curriculums, some that we've developed, some that we've worked with the university to develop. And we're hitting communities all around the state. And actually the pandemic has made it in some ways easier for us to reach a lot of the remote communities that we have in Alaska because we don't have to fly there anymore. People are starting to get used to using Zoom and other platforms like this. Next, please. These are just energy literacy principles that the Department of Energy has developed. I'm not going to go through all these, but just to show you that these principles do exist. The Department of Energy thinks they're important. They are pretty much on the same page as we are, that energy impacts everything. And so we got to make sure that kids growing up understand where energy comes from. That's a really important thing moving forward, because these kids are going to become consumers, they're going to become voters, they're going to become adult citizens that are really going to see a huge transition in their lifetime. Next, please. Because we've worked so much with the schools and the universities, we really realized there was a huge gap. So we created this thing called the Alaska Network for Energy Education and Employment, or ANE, and this is a network that we launched over 4 years ago to really pull together the different sectors, the K through 12, the vocational and training folks, and the university sectors, who rarely actually talk to each other. And yet they can form a pipeline for careers in energy. We have wound up seeing so many gaps that we're also spending time filling them and developing a lot of creative collaborations between different entities that are already existent in the state, but may not have an understanding of how they could be working together. This is a really important program, and we're trying to build this one bigger. Next, please. I mentioned this, the Energy Transitions Initiative Partnership Project. This is a new initiative for us, although we've worked on something similar with a different name for several years with partners in Maine and Hawaii. And now we're working as well with people in Southeast Alaska and the Caribbean. The idea here is that the national labs and DOE understand that small remote communities like we have in Alaska do have this huge opportunity and challenge with their energy. So regional entities like REAP and ACEP are working with the national labs to liaison with communities that we can provide technical assistance to. And this program has a huge potential. It just got launched a few months ago. Next, please. I like this slide. An intern of ours developed it from an idea that I had a few years ago. The idea is that we're wasting so much energy. We're calculating or estimating probably pretty accurately that Alaskans collectively are spending $5 billion a year on energy. That's for transportation, electricity, as well as heating. And we're conservatively wasting 20% of it. So 20% of 5 billion is $1 billion bonfire. Those of us in Alaska who like to stand around a bonfire understand this. It's like all of us standing around every year and throwing more than $1,000 in the flames. And that's what we're doing just by burning fuels inefficiently. So we look at energy efficiency as our first fuel. It's a super important concept for people to understand. It's not just the generation of electricity or heat. It's really just making sure that you're doing it efficiently and you're conserving it. Next, please. So I mentioned this program before, super successful. The legislature appropriated $640 million, more than 50,000 homes got weatherized, the average savings 30%, over 25 million gallons of diesel fuel equivalent every year saved. But then what happened? State went into fiscal crisis. There's no more grant money. We've got another 100,000 homes that we'd like to weatherize. We've got all kinds of commercial businesses that we want to weatherize. How do we do it? Next, please. So for the last few years, we've been working on different concepts to finance and really have settled on the idea of developing a green bank for Alaska. But people may ask, why can't just the private sector banks do it? Why don't you just go down to the corner bank and get a loan? Well, there's a few reasons. First, there's a short track record for clean energy financing. My analogy is you couldn't get a car loan the day cars were invented. Banks had to figure out the risk profile. They had to understand what they were loaning money for. And banks arguably correctly see these energy projects, $20,000, $30,000 projects, small and distributed. It's a lot of transactions, and there's no secondary market. There's been no secondary market for these kinds of clean energy loans, and things just move slowly. It's human behavior. Next, please. So a green bank concept is really starting to sprout around the country. There's now more than 15 green banks in the country. We've been working really closely with the first green bank, the Connecticut Green Bank, which has a successful track record. They have an 8-to-1 leverage ratio, meaning that for every dollar the state of Connecticut is putting into an energy project, they're getting the private sector to bring in 8. So that's the whole point of a green bank. You want to leverage a modest amount of state money or federal money and bring in private investment. So there's typically a relationship with government. There's a focus on commercial technologies. And we have been working to support a federal green bank called the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator Act for several years, now 2 years. That's got a lot of traction. It's passed the House of Representatives twice. Our Representative Don Young just co-sponsored it. He's one of the first Republicans to co-sponsor. And yesterday, President Biden mentioned it in his infrastructure package. So this would provide money back to state green banks, importantly for investment, but also even more importantly for operational capital. We're also working with the state of Alaska right now to introduce a bill for a green bank at the state, and the governor supports it. So we're hopeful that we will develop a green bank soon in our state. Next, please. What does climate change have to do with our electric grid? Well, I would argue everything. Everything's moving toward electricity and renewables. The concept of beneficial electrification. We need in Alaska a grid that prepares us for those opportunities. And so we've been working for many years, following on many before us to develop a more modern grid in the state. Next, please. So our rail belt grid, what we call the rail belt, which is the one I showed you before from Homer up to the Kenai to Anchorage and to Fairbanks, 600 miles long, has one big problem. It's really long, but there's hardly any people. There's 550 or 600,000 people. The whole, and until recently, there was 6 utilities serving those people. The average annual load of that grid is relatively the same size as half of a power plant in the lower 48. So we've got in my lingo 6 cooks in the kitchen, all trying to operate a relatively small grid. There's now 5. One of the utilities swallowed up another, but it still has been pretty inefficient. And our regulatory commission has been upset about it. Our legislature has been increasingly upset about it. We don't have a system of economic dispatch. We don't have regional planning. We don't have regional reliability standards or connection standards or a regional transmission tariff. This is all bad for business because if you're an independent power producer and you want to come to Alaska and get into this grid, it has been difficult. So one of the main reasons we've been involved is to promote more renewable energy on our grid. And we believe this is one way to get there. Next, please. It's really the mechanical way to get it done. I love this picture. Jim Palin, Sarah Palin's father-in-law, sent me this picture after we passed Senate Bill 123 last year. He used to be the general manager of one of the utilities, and he's pictured there, the second guy from the left. He was running Matanuska Electric in 1983 when this article appeared, and they thought they had it solved in 1983. 37 years later, we got Senate Bill 123 passed last year. So this is how long and difficult it has been to actually move toward an integrated grid and we're still working on it. We're still working in the regulatory process, developing rules. We are still working to develop an organization that will become our first electric reliability organization for the rail belt grid. But I love this picture because it really just it paints a picture of how long folks have been working on this. Next, please. So without going into all these details, this is what Grid Reform will do. It's really risk management. We have a huge risk if we don't do this. We have really a lot of fuel price volatility in Cook Inlet. We are 85% reliant on natural gas, and we're paying 3 times for natural gas what lower 48 utilities are paying. So that's a problem that we can, delve into. Climate risk and carbon taxes are another. Technology innovation might be the biggest. Solar and wind are now the cheapest electricity on the planet. Customer needs and desires are changing quickly. People are going to be moving to electric cars and putting solar on their homes. And grid resiliency and cybersecurity are increasingly important. Next, please. So I love this picture here because it shows our northern lights, but it also gives you a glimpse of how really small and fragile our atmosphere is. I live 65 miles away from Anchorage, which is where I'm calling you from today. I'm closer to outer space than I am to Anchorage. Outer space is 62 miles up. Anchorage is 65 miles that direction. And so, our atmosphere is small, it's fragile. People are realizing that more and more. Energy technology is completely changing, and we're moving toward a clean energy transition. Next, please. this is what we've got to do. We've got to really focus on public-private partnerships, align our goals, develop some real policy here in the state, not just programs, and make energy efficiency and education and energy literacy some of our primary goals. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you folks today.
Thanks so much, Chris. So many thoughts come to mind as I've listened to both of you speak so far. And Hugh, we're really looking forward to hearing what you'll be sharing. Go ahead and take it away, and we'll follow up with questions and answers as for all of you. So be sure to let us know in the Q&A if you guys have questions. Take it away, Hugh.
Great. Betsy's going to drive the PowerPoint. So quick introduction. My name is Hugh Short. I was actually on Twitter last night, and there was a little feed on Room Rater. So they rate rooms of people on TV, and out of 10, I'm solidly a 1 out of 10. That's my joke for the day, guys. Next slide, please. PT Capital, I started PT Capital about 8 years ago. Prior to PT Capital, I had about a decade at ASRC, Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, managing a portfolio primarily of debt with a company called Alaska Growth Capital. Around 2011, 2012, there became a lot of discussions nationally and internationally about the Arctic as an investment theme, really driven by some luminaries in finance, folks like David Rubenstein, Scott Minerd, folks who really thought that at that time there was a huge opportunity to enter into the market. From there, I built a team. Currently, we're a team just under 10. Really have 4 key values, goals that we're currently working on. One is to attract capital to Alaska. The second, to broaden Alaska's financial services industry. Third, to act as a good corporate citizen. And then the fourth is to create value by leveraging the team's operational excellence, financial expertise, and then implementing organizational best practices. I think attracting capital to Alaska, in 2015, we created the first institutional grade private equity fund in Alaska. That fund has been deployed. And of that fund, 93% of the money that we raised to deploy into Alaska, as well as the rest of the Arctic, was money from outside of Alaska. So that's insurance companies, Asian investors from Europe, a huge amount of interest in being able to put money to work in locations in the world where there was less competition, lower multiples, all those things that I'll jump into here in a bit. The second point broadens Alaska, just back real quick. The second point, broadening Alaska's financial services industry. I think this point's really been expanded over the last year with COVID. I currently have an employee who 16 months ago was living in London, managing our European assets, who currently has relocated to Seattle. And before the work at home craze happened, he had been doing it for 3 years. And so I think broadening Alaska's financial services industry today, really, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to attract folks to Alaska and work in the financial services industry. The Alaska Permanent Fund has recognized an opportunity and has put a couple $100 million to work with the goal ultimately in 2024 of raising the amount of capital from the APFC to Alaska in excess of 5% of the principal balance. Next slide, please. So this is a map of where we currently have assets and where we're currently looking to deploy additional assets. We currently manage a portfolio of about $335 million. and our team has aggregate 1 billion of debt and equity transactions closed in the Arctic. Our industry sector exposure includes tourism, telecommunications, remote logistics, hospitality, and industrial services. Quickly going around the map, in Alaska, we currently operate just under 20 helicopters, either through Alpine Air or a recent acquisition called Vertical Solutions. The real opportunity there is continued growth in tourism. Though COVID has prevented a 2020 tourist season, is going to greatly hinder the 2021 season, primarily due to the cruise ship ban in Canada, as well as the CDC's hesitance to give the green light for US-based cruising. We still anticipate the 2021 season to be on the independent, on the people flying to Alaska, it's going to be a robust season, we believe. All signs indicate, if you talk to folks in the tourism industry, you talk to folks like Scott at Alaska Airlines, you look at the number of flights being booked, flights being scheduled, and seats being booked, it is going to be I think a better than expected season in Alaska. And there's a lot of trends pointing to that. We have exposure up on the North Slope through a company called Ice Services, which currently holds the top market position for camp catering and utility services based in Prudhoe Bay. We currently have exposure to the steel recycling and recycling sector in Alaska, primarily exported to Seattle, our product. We are focused on building out renewable energy for buildings and improving systems within buildings as a recognition that, as the Biden administration announced yesterday in the $2 trillion infrastructure package, a large piece of that is going towards federal buildings and commercial buildings to increase their energy efficiency. I'll get back to Alaska a bit more. Moving over towards the other parts of the Arctic where we currently have exposure, we are joint venture partners, own approximately 50% of the largest mobile phone company in Iceland. We are currently deploying a 5G technology across the country. Iceland is among the world leaders in data consumption. I believe I think if I looked at the KPIs from last month at Nova, our average customer was using just under 20 gigabits of data per month. You compare that to Alaska, and the last numbers that I saw, we were in the single digits here in Alaska. So it's a huge data consumptive society. It has done innovative things such as the government sponsoring fiber to 98% of the country, where operators like us have access to that fiber and then can provide last mile solutions and deliver that to the households and the businesses. An area we've spent a lot of time the last 6-8 months is our hospitality assets in Iceland and Finland. Currently, we operate about 16 hotels in both of those countries. Most of those properties today have been shut due to COVID and border closings. It's an area that I probably, it's a 10-hour difference this time of year and an 8-hour difference in Iceland. So my hours of sleep and awake have been quite hectic the last 6 months. We currently have been the first company in Iceland. There's about 4 major hotel companies. And we've recently restructured and grown our capital base to take advantage of the opportunities in Iceland as COVID has affected the tourism sector significantly. The gods have blessed us in Iceland recently with a volcano. that we're seeing just Icelanders anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 Icelanders per day taking the trek, which is about a 45-minute hike from the nearest road to go see the volcano, which anyone guesses this could be erupting anywhere between 3 weeks to 200 years. So very scientific projection there. Hopefully borders open up. Iceland's recently announced that North America and Icelandair, if you have a vaccine, proof of a vaccine, you can enter the country. That's been delayed by a couple of weeks, but anticipate in May those borders open. And I think there will be an influx of folks who want to get out, would like to travel, would like social distancing, such as Iceland, and would like to see a volcano and a lot of the amazing things that happen over there. Over in Finland, the situation currently is deployment of vaccines has been slow in Europe, hindered by a number of different factors. Just had a board meeting 2 days ago. The good thing about both of these countries is the government has been very supportive of the industries, either through payroll injections from the government or access to government guaranteed loans to be able to weather the storm on favorable terms. So those are things that have certainly been taking my time the last 6 to 8 months. Next slide, please. Looking forward for PT Capital, our next iteration, we're currently very active and deploying additional capital. We're very focused on Alaska, given the Alaska Permanent Fund's interest in additional capital being deployed. There's really 5 themes that we're looking at. Sustainable fisheries is a theme that we believe the demand for protein is going to increase. There are opportunities to be able to deploy into newer technologies or consolidation within the industry, working with strong operational partners. Both of the previous speakers spoke towards clean fuel potential. We see a large opportunity to be able to participate in that. PT Capital is very focused on, I'd say, we're not an early stage investor, so many of the companies we invest in actually have, they're generating revenue, they're profitable, and either there is a generational shift or an opportunity to bring in additional capital to reduce the need for the existing shareholders to grow to the next step. So we see some opportunities there. Metals and minerals, there's some exciting things going on in that sector that we believe that there could be some potential to deploy capital. Global trade, I think we all saw last week the Suez Canal and how that disrupted global trade significantly, and we'll feel the repercussions for probably the months to come, which I think puts a spotlight on the northern shipping route and additional ways to move trade, so we're not so dependent on choke points that could essentially set global GDP back significantly with one incident. And the strategic geolocation of the Arctic. We think the military, the federal government, at least in the US, is looking at deploying additional capital into bolstering the defenses from the Alaska position, which could create immense opportunity for private investment into companies who take advantage of that trend. Next slide, please. This slide is a lot of big words with a lot of big themes. I'm not going to get into it. I think just at a high level, we've got a huge opportunity, especially with you folks in Washington State. We are intensely focused on the Pacific Northwest and how we can invest into companies in the Pacific Northwest that take advantage of some of the characteristics in Alaska that can create more shareholder value. And that's either through the consolidation of logistical routes, the value chain, whether it's seafood or resources, and really being able to attract additional capital to Alaska to deploy into companies where we think there's higher returns based on the opportunities I think the last report that I read on private equity in the lower 48 was about a 12-time multiple on EBITDA. So valuations in some of the larger markets have, with the debt as low as it is today, has caused a huge jump in valuations. I think the valuations we see in our markets is somewhere between 5 to 7 times. Sometimes you get to 8 times EBITDA. So there certainly is some attractive valuations to take advantage of. Next slide, please. This is a slide that one of our LPs, Guggenheim Partners, put together a few years ago, and I think it was recently updated. And it really shows the amount of infrastructure spend that has been defined for the Arctic. This includes all of the countries within that circle, and of that, they've identified 500 billion of global GRP for the Arctic, of which 335 million of that is demand that we've actually seen. So that's demand that we've seen, took advantage of, and deployed into. Just around 3 billion of that is companies that we've looked at since 2015. And so if you look at a $500 billion market to deploy into fossil fuels, transportation, mining, renewable energy, and power, there will be a continued amount of capital required. Next slide, please. That's my last slide. I'd be happy to take any questions. And thank you, Betsy.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So one thing that Hugh did not mention as he outlined his background, in addition to these financial aspects that he's been talking about, he's actually got some boots on the ground experience serving as the mayor of Bethel, Alaska from 2002 to 2004. And he's currently a board member for Rural Energy Enterprises. So thanks very much, Hugh. We're going to go into an audience questions session right now. You can raise your hand in that electronic little mitten looking thing, or just post something in the chat thing to let us know to call on you. We do have an initial question from Ephraim Froelich. Ephraim, do you want to phrase your question? And then Isaac, I know you chimed in a little bit in the chat, but I think there's some broader perspectives here. So Ephraim?
Yeah, hey, well, yeah, Isaac, thank you for responding so quickly in the chat. And that sounds like some really exciting stuff. And it's exciting to hear the Denali Commission is going to be making those investments as well. And I'm really optimistic about the Denali Commission on a separate note, because we might have earmarks coming back any day now. So there could be some really interesting funding opportunities at the federal level with the Denali Commission as a funnel. But yeah, so, in the meantime, I guess I would love to hear then, the second part of my question, how are your organizations, whether that's Isaac, Chris, or Hugh, kind of expanding opportunity in remote areas in lieu of, those opportunities happening right now with expanded broadband, et cetera. And how are we getting around the barriers of, when you're out in Dutch, which is, the shipping capital of the world for fisheries, and you can't open your phone. My wife called me on a trip out to Dutch a couple of years ago, and she got a $200 phone bill because it pinged off of a Russian tower or something like that. So I mean, how are we getting around those obstacles to do business?
Well, I'll take I actually just had a conversation with GCI yesterday to catch up on what they're doing, and I was out in Bethel last Wednesday. Spent the day out in Bethel, and if you look back 10 years ago to today, high-speed broadband in rural Alaska did not exist, and I think Chris alluded to it, but you can communicate. Costs have come down, and many locations across rural Alaska, either through a terrestrial microwave system or a fiber build out. You go to the Aleutians, I don't recall what the number announced yesterday was going into broadband, but there's currently a build all the way to Dutch Harbor. And as far as Shemya, of fiber, undersea fiber that GCI is currently sponsoring. Quintillion a few years ago put hundreds of millions of dollars into an undersea fiber project. So, slowly but surely these solutions are getting built out, and it's been expensive. My hope is that there's more federal support. I alluded to Iceland, which the government has sponsored the build out of much of the infrastructure, and the private sector takes advantage of it through a competition to be able to access it. So every country does it a different way, but I think Alaska slowly but surely is joining, joining the lower 48 in access. And certainly there's its hindrances, but it seems to get better day by day.
And if I could just add on to that, Ephraim, before some of that infrastructure is built, which I'm reading into your question, I think is like, you're also asking, what do we do until then? And what opportunities are there until then? And I do think, so often is the case in Alaska, that some of our challenges and some of the problems that we're working on are actually some of our greatest advantages when at least our organization is trying to recruit companies to do work in the state. We joke about it as like, we got to take that frown and turn it upside down. If you're a company that's trying to do business with a technology, let's say for the military, where they're operating in places where there's no connectivity or limited connectivity, Alaska is a great place to partner with communities and organizations to show that your technology can work in a low internet bandwidth environment. And so I do think, speaking of Iceland, Gwen Holdman at ASEP oftentimes talks about, how they've set themselves up as a deployment ground or a proving ground for geothermal. And they've really developed a whole industry around having companies that come there, work with folks in Iceland to learn about their geothermal, and they've started spinning off companies and university programs based on that resource. I do think there's a similar, to Gwen's credit, I do think there's a similar opportunity in Alaska where we can be a place where, communities throughout the state can host or partner with or act as a deployment partner for some of these companies to work with local utilities to bring down the cost of energy, which has knock-on effects for economic development in those communities. And then also, we've had a few examples already with companies like Box Power or 60 Hertz, where it's so valuable for them to have a customer in some of these communities that they have on their own dime, on their own nickel, have paid for workforce development training effectively, where they've held multi-day trainings for rural power plant managers, or they've trained some local folks on how to get onto one of the Box Power units and set them up and kind of get the solar up and running. And I think there's opportunity there where some of these companies, because showing that they can get traction and their technology works is so valuable, they end up on their own dime supporting some kind of really workforce development efforts in communities. And I just think there's kind of in this opportunity in this area, Alaska working with some of leading energy transition globally and working with innovative companies to, we have over 250 independent microgrids in the state. So if you're a company that wants to sell to a large utility elsewhere, come through Alaska, you have 250 chances to make a sale to a utility and then go from here to larger markets. And there's real economic upside for communities throughout the state with that kind of thing. And I could say the same thing with transportation and food and water. There's similar opportunities. It's not just in microgrids.
I just add two things quickly. Satellite-based internet may or may not happen. Starlink is looking at Alaska right now. That could be one answer to your question, Ephraim. And then I would just really emphasize what Isaac said about human capacity building and workforce development. Ultimately, that is our greatest resource in Alaska, is our people. And we have a lot of folks who could really develop a ton of skills. And ultimately, many of the communities we're talking about are not communities that are likely to be places that somebody from Seattle or Portland wants to move to. They might move to Anchorage, but they're not going to move to a remote community. So if those communities want this technology, ultimately they're going to be responsible for maintaining it and operating it, and over time optimizing it. So we're really focused on building that human capacity around the state.
Thanks very much to all of you. This is a hugely important topic, and I think you've each provided some great perspectives that are complementary. But we have another question coming in from Rich Berkowitz. Rich, do you want to?
Sure. Sure. Thank you, George. I guess this might impact both Isaac, Chris, and you. I know Isaac mentioned working with Teck. I didn't know whether that was Teck Cominco Mining or some other company. But I've long had an interest in rare earth minerals and its potential in Alaska. I just saw in the Financial Times the other day that I think BMW and Volvo and a couple other corporations said they were not going to be purchasing metal minerals that were mined from the ocean, given some of the environmental concerns that are outstanding. They wanted to get those questions answered before they sought to purchase that. So, you know, there is a fair amount of rare earth minerals up in Alaska to the extent that it can be mined, both economically and I guess environmentally sound. Perhaps there's some promise there. And I also wanted to ask, since it kind of fell off my radar screen, is whatever happened to the clean coal project up in Healy, which I guess in the Biden administration would be an oxymoron. But if anyone could, and I know they got a fair amount of, I think mostly public funding at one point, but if anyone has any comments on that, I'd welcome to hear.
I could start with the clean coal plant. That is arguably the most expensive coal plant on the planet because of all the state and federal subsidies that went into it. And it finally got commissioned after almost 20 years of experimenting and failure and problems. And it's operating right now. It's a 50 megawatt plant. The clean referred only to taking some of the pollutants like nitrous oxide out of the air. It had nothing to do with carbon dioxide. So that terminology was framed well before a lot of concern about climate change was in the public. So there's no technology, as we know, for taking carbon dioxide out of the air economically yet. But that is an operating coal plant on the grid, but highly subsidized, and unfortunately didn't really hit the mark with the original technology. And as long as I'm talking, I'll just mention that I don't know a lot about where those rare earth minerals might be in the state. I've heard discussions about Prince of Wales Island, which is far south and southeast. And again, mining is always going to take energy. So that, you know, there's a lot of discussion about, well, if you're in a remote place and you don't have access to a road or a transmission line, more than likely you're going to be thinking about renewable energy. So there have been a lot of discussions about mining and remote renewable energy. Sometimes very difficult to get the scale of power you need for a real mining operation. But we've had more than one mining company approach REAP just to ask questions about, well, how could we find enough renewable energy, let's say in Cook Inlet, to process ore from around Nome, for instance. There's a lot of opportunity if we want to try to concentrate on bringing industry to energy. instead of thinking about places and saying, well, we can't do anything there because there's only 5,000 people living there. And that resource is a resource for 200,000 people. We got to think out of the box and think, well, what energy intensive industries might we bring to a place that has the energy? And that's what Iceland has done. So.
Thank you. Anyone else? You? Or?
Yeah, I think, I used to be the chair of ADA, and it's been a number of years, but I think the real challenge with rare earths is not the rare earths itself. It's it's the refining of the rare earths. It's the existing technology is incredibly toxic and dirty, and no one wants one in their backyard. That's why China actually dominates the market, is because their environmental regulations are 0 to nil when it comes to rare earths. And so my last discussion was with a gentleman who's working on a project in Greenland, and Greenland didn't want the refining in Greenland, but they've got immense resource of rare earths. And so until the technology exists where you can refine in a way that doesn't destroy the environment around it, there's going to be a bottleneck in the West to be able to do that. Or you're just going to have to cooperate with some other countries to identify a location where, people don't mind the environment getting damaged. And so that's the real bottleneck for rare earths. And I don't know anything recent, but seems like the conversation's been stuck there for a decade.
Thank you.
I'll chime in and just say that I believe you'll be seeing some action and information coming forth from the Department of Energy as we look at this whole critical minerals, critical materials, rare earth topic. Hugh, I think you're spot on in terms of looking at it's not just the mineral, it's how do you make it into something useful in an acceptable footprint kind of manner. We've got another question coming in from Ephraim. And I love the fact that this brings in not just energy, but it brings in this food, this water quality, et cetera, aspects. Ephraim, do you want to phrase your question, and then we'll just have a free for all in terms of responding?
Sure, yeah, not to take up all the time. But yeah, so, I'm a policy consultant in the ocean and, fishery spaces, and this is something everybody's talking about, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you guys are viewing mariculture prospects for the state of Alaska, how big it can be, timelines, just the economic opportunities, challenges to get there. I'm curious about just generally mariculture investments. We're hearing so much about it for fishermen in the off season, but also for folks just to be investing. I heard somebody say that recently that Alaska can be the Saudi Arabia of kelp. So it's seems like there's a lot of chatter and a lot of opportunity. I'd just love to know from your guys' awesome startup and financial brains what that sounds like.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond just broadly with yes. I'm super excited about the mariculture and maritime overall for the state. There's a group here locally that's spun up recently called the Alaska Ocean Cluster that recently received a little bit of funding from the EDA and has a couple folks, that are full-time staff there, and they're really trying to build out, a whole innovation cluster around ocean. And we talk a lot with them, and we're trying to get them stood up because we think there's a huge opportunity for value-added processing and also all sorts of technology around, electric propulsion and getting fuel out of, kind of maritime vessels, as well as a huge data opportunity. We have one company, Blue Ocean Gear, that we worked with that has these little smart buoys where they're working with the Bering Sea Crabbers Association to do monitoring lost equipment and recover lost equipment. They recently had their first, they're running a pilot, but just recently had a success story where one of the vessels, because they had a buoy attached, they were able to communicate to someone else that was on their way back to pick up some lost equipment. It was like $100,000 that they recovered and just would have gone to the bottom of the ocean. So there's just, I think, a really interesting data side of this and ocean monitoring. So yeah, really excited. At launch, I think if any of those technologies have an energy aspect to them, or some kind of decarbonizing element to save fuel or have energy efficiency, we'd be interested. We're also realizing that the companies that are applying to our program oftentimes it's within the water vertical in the sense of municipal utilities and wastewater treatment and like rural sanitation and infrastructure tied to waste and water. There's a lot of applications in there and a lot of technologies that we're excited about, and that's kind of where we're spending most of our time. But really excited about the future of kind of maritime in Alaska.
Yeah, with regard to mariculture, I'm not an expert, and so it gets really deep really quick. But the problem, at least from where I've seen it, and actually one of my first jobs out of college was selling oysters, is scalability. It's just a hard space to scale because you've got, hopefully there's no oyster farmers on this call, but you got some, not normal people out in the middle of nowhere, farming these things. And to me, it's a scale problem. And I haven't been able to see a business case or strategy to be able to sort of grow this into a large organization and the coordination. So again, it gets really deep in the pool for me when I start thinking about this. But there's people like Mead Treadwell who I wish he was on the call because he could spend the next 30 minutes talking about mariculture. But yeah, that's the best answer I got.
Yeah, I would just add that the Oceans Cluster folks would be great to talk to, from Justin Sternberg, Taylor Holthauser. The seafood processing industries where we've thought more about, just because there's so much seafood that's being processed on tenders or in Seattle area, and that value add obviously should be happening in Alaska. And oftentimes the issue is folks can't even afford to make ice, with local energy. So, I mean, there are real solvable problems there, I think, with energy where where the seafood's coming out of the ocean that we'd like to solve first.
Awesome. So I guess I'd like to ask one other question, and then we'll kind of draw our conversation today to a close. We kind of introduced this whole thing as kind of like this regional, not just Alaska ecosystem of entrepreneurship and innovation. I'd like to ask you guys, how would you recommend that people who would like to participate in the Alaska context, how would they understand where they would fit? What would you see as ways to broaden this greater Northwest potential for engagement?
Well, I can start because one way that REAP interacts with folks around the country is that they become members of REAP. And that's just not a pitch to become a member, but then people are engaged. We have quarterly board meetings, but more importantly, we have a lot of committee meetings where people can call in from anywhere and be engaged with particularly the policy aspects of what's going on in Alaska. But I think that's one way to do it. We also are happy to connect people, just as I know Hugh and Isaac both are, but we have a lot of people in Alaska who would like to know you. And if there's a way for us to be a bridge builder, we'd be happy to do that.
I would also just invite anyone that's interested to be a panelist in our program. As I said before, it's really fun, meet a lot of folks. It's very valuable to our companies and to us, and it's a good way to kind of get a survey of everything that we're doing in our broader network. So if you're interested, reach out, or if you also, any of the companies in our portfolio are interesting to you, or any of the projects we're working on, happy to connect individually and talk to you more about those, or connect you to other folks that are involved.
Yeah, we're super interested in the Pacific Northwest, and I would flip the question to how can I get more piped into what you guys are doing? Because we've now got boots on the ground. I think we bring a certain amount of expertise to the Pacific Northwest that could, I think, be beneficial to some companies. We're leaning into that space quite a bit. So, it's a 3-hour flight. I can be down there. My colleague, Kevin Payne, I'm going to encourage him to become a member of the chamber. And yeah, we're super excited about the Pacific Northwest and just being able to get a better understanding of the landscape. I've probably spent the last 6 months on calls just trying to figure it out. There's some folks that's been on these calls that I've reached out to learn more and figure out what the opportunities are.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. Betsy, I'm not seeing any other questions right now. Are there any that I'm missing?
None that I'm seeing, George.
Okay, well, Betsy, thank you so much for helping coordinate this really great exchange in terms of these. We wish we were all together, but we're doing great, I think, this Zoom thing. Do you have final remarks or what's coming up kind of things? And go ahead and close us out.
Thanks, George. Few thank yous. Thank you for everyone attending today. Really appreciate it. Once again, want to thank our sponsor, Alaska Airlines, and Scott Haberstad, as always, for helping to support our programs. Of course, a huge thank you to our speakers for their time and energy today. Isaac, Hugh, and Chris, appreciate you so much. And I just want to give a special shout out to George Rowe, who is our amazing Alaska Business Forum chair. He's been chairing our programs for 2 years. This is his last forum with us. I couldn't wrangle him for a 3rd year, unfortunately, but just really please join me in a virtual clap for George. I really appreciate you and all your work to make our forums great. As George mentioned at the beginning of our program, this will be our last program for a bit. We're taking a bit of a hiatus as the Chamber focuses on vaccine clinic, their economic recovery work. So please do keep a lookout in your inboxes for a survey for this last season to let me know how things went, any ideas for our future season, and then we will reach out once we have a schedule looking into the fall. So until then, please stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.